Welcome to those who are rejoining us and to those who are newly tuning in for the inaugural Online Boarding Schools Summit. As part of this panel, we're going to explore an important topic based on a question we should all be asking: how are Australian boarding schools lifting their game? Our discussion today will centre on the professional capacities of staff, the important topics of mental health management, and perhaps the things that underpin it all, nutrition and physical health. Richard Stokes is the founder and director of Australian Boarding Schools Association, and with a long career as an educator in a number of different capacities, he's deeply devoted to the growth of professionalism in the boarding school sector. He's committed to promoting excellent practice in all of our nation's boarding schools. Fiona Aveyard is a fifth-generation lamb producer and is the founder of the paddock-to-plate operation called Outback Lamb. Her mantelpiece is absolutely groaning with gongs from the agricultural, food and business sectors, including being very recently announced as a Nuffield Scholar. She's an ardent advocate for rural and remote regions, family farming and the telling of their stories. She's also a former boarder and a current boarding school parent. George Michaelides and Fiona Seabridge are representing a company called Chartwells, with which many of you will be familiar through its catering for many of Australia's top boarding schools. They both have extensive experience in the education sector, and they're both devoted to the notion of tailored catering solutions and to the importance of nutrition for overall well-being in a boarding environment. Can I start by asking all of you panellists, the good old, bad old days, what has changed, what needs to change in the boarding schools environment? Perhaps, Richard, we could start with you as the founding head of the Australian Boarding Schools Association.
So thanks for joining us too. It's really good to be able to talk about this. This probably could go on for about 4 or 5 hours, to be honest, this question. But let's be honest, I started working in boarding back in 1979, and the greatest problem that we experienced in those days was that we just didn't have enough staff. You know, the expectation upon staff back in the early 80s was to look after more than 100 kids each. Thankfully, that's no longer the case. And what we've been able to do over the last 20 years at least, maybe longer than that, is actually professionalise the industry. The Australian Boarding Schools Association works pretty hard at training staff. We train over 1,000 staff a year in the base level duty of care course, but now provide 60 webinars a year, provide certificate courses in all sorts of areas, including mental health, and helping understand kids with that. And so I think the professionalising of the industry is the exciting thing that we're seeing, which means that our kids are much better looked after, there are more people to look after them, and there are much better provisions in the boarding house. And that probably sums up a long conversation in a few words.
That's the snapshot. Fiona Aveyard, as a former boarder and as a current parent, what do you recall from your days that has changed or needed to change? And what are some of the things that you think need to carry over from the old days?
Well, I remember clearly, my eldest is just doing her HSC, so leaving school, but I remember clearly the early days when we were looking at boarding schools and when she first started. And I remember that the boarding house had changed completely from when I was at a different school, but it had changed completely because it was recognised as a space for the children. So we had to be invited into their dorms if we had arrived at the school and weren't, didn't have an organised inspection. The staff just said to us, "Look, we're really sorry, the girls weren't expecting any guests today. Next time you come, you're more than welcome to have a look. Just let us know." And the stark contrast from my own experience in the 80s when parents were around and we had to keep everything like absolutely shipshape, and we were stood, military style at the end of our beds when anyone came around, really gave me a great sense of comfort, because I thought, well, they recognise that the kids need their own space, that while they're at boarding school, they also need a home, and it was just a really lovely fruit. It was a home more than a boarding house.
And Richard, that professionalism that the Australian Boarding Schools Association is trying to bring so much more into the boarding houses, do you like Fiona has just touched on there? Do you think that that's a sense of comfort for parents?
Oh, there's no doubt in my mind that that's the case. We work pretty closely with the Isolated Children's Parents Association, as 75% of our kids are rural and remote kids in the first place. And they tell me very clearly that concept of having professionals look after their kids is paramount. You know, you wouldn't put a teacher in front of a class unless they were qualified. Why would you put somebody into a boarding house unless they'd done some training as well?
And a question to both you, George and Fiona Seabridge, that professionalism is also carrying over into the kitchens of boarding schools. I remember back in my day, you know, food for a boarder, and I guess is still the case, is the focal point of the day. But the food standards have changed enormously, haven't they? And needed to.
Yeah, I recall when, George and I have both worked in the industry as well for a very long time. And my earliest memories are of sliced meat sitting in a stainless steel tray in a pool of magic gravy with mashed potatoes served from an ice cream scoop, and green khaki peas and beans. And then in the dining room itself, huge barrels of brightly coloured cordials. And, you know, if I reflect on that, you know, where the food and the focus on creating a community and a wellbeing focused environment has completely shifted. And so our requirement to engage more professional levels of staff and a lot more rigorous programs around standards and safety and compliance support that. So it's a very, very different landscape.
And I think also, just to add to that, the entire infrastructure's changed as well. I remember 25 years ago that, you know, a lot of the kitchens and the serveries is completely different today. So the whole experience in the dining room, that sense of place, that sort of gathering together, and food's become a key pillar in boarding for schools. It's a real point of difference, and I think today a lot of boarders are really engaging. They're really interested in food, and that relationship between food and their well-being is really important to them. So that's been a huge change over the last 25 years.
And Fiona Aveyard, as somebody who works in the food industry herself, and perhaps you might explain a little bit about what it is that you do, but as somebody who works in that food industry, this must be, and as a parent, this must be music to your ears.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm lucky enough to have a couple of kids away at school at the moment, and Chartwells cater for one of those. And my son particularly, he's like, Mum, the food's amazing. That's what he like. And he's not a fussy eater by any stretch of the imagination, but he loves the cultural nights. He loves the, it's exposed him to food that I don't even cook at home, and made him a lot more adventurous with his palate. It's been a great part of his education, to be fair.
Richard, that profession, that crossover with the holistic approach to boarding is part of this new professionalism that I certainly, 40 years ago, as a boarder, didn't experience. You know, we were round pegs in square holes a lot.
Yeah, I think the whole concept about understanding that those people who look after the boarders have a really critical job in a school is something that is growing. It's something that I was lucky enough to experience way back in the early 80s, but I know that it's really improved dramatically since. And it's about actually turning out nice young people rather than about just babysitting them. And I do think really we were pretty good at babysitting in the old days, and that was about the best we could do. The reality is now it's about making sure every bit's right, you know, from making sure that they learn life skills, to making sure they eat well, to making sure that they can do the best they can with their studies, whatever that might be, in vocational studies or in academic studies. And just, you know, that general care and well-being has become a critical part of what is a very exciting industry.
And look, we'll go back to that holistic approach again, because I think that's something that's really important. But Fiona, you just touched on that diversity. We're talking about the diversity of palates, but how, for all four of you, how has the experience of boarding school and the way in which, and we're talking about how boarding schools are lifting their games, the importance of that diversity, how are schools working on practicing and celebrating diversity in their communities? Perhaps Fiona, Fiona Aveyard, you could maybe take that one.
They definitely have like a lot of groups and mentor groups and special collaborations to celebrate significant dates in anyone who's in boarding in their culture. So whether they be Indigenous or Chinese or from Hong Kong or wherever they're from, whatever their background, boarding houses, in my experience, really do a lot to recognise those significant dates. And again, like Richard said, they're really focused on putting out great, well-rounded individuals. And there is an expectation of performance. Don't get me wrong, like people, whether they're academic or musical or just general, good community people, it is about kids are in a culture where they're expected to do their best. And the schools, in my experience, seem to really recognise that. They understand that they can't expect these kids to perform at their very elite level if they don't nourish them, if they don't provide good mental health skills, and particularly more in the recent years. I guess with COVID and stuff, I've noticed the emergence of mental health focus within the boarding community, whether it's the girls doing yoga, whether it's the opportunity to talk, whether it's access to professionals within the school at any time. They can just pop into like the appropriate clinic or reach out to the person and get and access them really quickly. Like it's and even with my own kids, I particularly noticed that it's not like there's no stigma attached, or there doesn't seem to be for my son anyway. Like he says, oh, I had to go to the wellbeing clinic today. I just really want to talk about such and such. And I was like, and I just love that it's such a natural part of his life now. And it's probably, when they're in a new world, so it's completely different to the farm. So I love that they're clearly being given the skills to deal with any adjustments they have to make.
And George, in terms of what Chartwells obviously takes care of the catering and the food and the nutrition side of things, but you're also very much intimately involved with the boarding school community. How are you seeing that diversity celebrated? And I guess how do you respond to the changes in diversity and the changes in culture and the cultural responsibilities that you have through your business?
Yeah, I suppose what we focus on is we always tailor our solutions to every school. So we have a look at the student profile. So look at whether they're just in terms of the background of the profile of students, and that really helps us tailor our menus and that interaction with food. So it's not a cookie cutter response for us, because otherwise that becomes more of a template solution. And that's been the real success of our model in the market, is to really understand the background of the school, the profile of the school, and the profile of the boarders. And work closely with the school community, and we do that through different forums. We have a lot of food-focused forums. We speak closely with the school community as well as the boarders, and I found over the last 20 years the feedback from the boarders has been really constructive, and that really helps us tailor our solution for them. And our menu profile then really backs that up as well. And that's what we found has really worked in that space.
Fiona Seabridge, do you have anything to add in that in terms of the response to different cultural, for instance, needs in the nutrition side of things?
I think it's about giving the students a voice and really allowing them to have their stamp on the service as well. We really try, as part of our whole program, is to educate, not dictate. And so engaging them in forums, as George has just mentioned, asking them what they would like to see, And if they do want an international day, if there is representation from the students from that country or area, actually asking them to work with us to really tailor and ensure that we're representing that culture properly and well, and letting them have their own personal stamp on it. So it's very inclusive. It's really important. We don't want to be seen as the contractor. And so it's really that partnership approach with the students and the broader school community. And that really does influence the outcome.
Richard, I note that the Australian Boarding Schools Association in this move to make the boarding staff more professional and inject that professionalism. There's an element, I think you do Chinese cultural response as a. Could you talk me through that and how that works and how that came about?
So we actually issue a number of certificates that people can study. They go over a period of time. So there are 14 of them on our books at the moment. One is understanding Chinese cultural competence. We have one building safe cultural landscapes for Indigenous kids. We have one about understanding risk. We have one about understanding how kids use technology, cyber safety and social media. Gaming, those sort of areas, they go on. There's a lot. So it's actually about giving people the opportunity to learn more about what they do. And it's interesting, even in our webinar program, like we've just recently had a really good webinar with Chartwells. So George and Fiona have been friends of ABSA since it started. And I mean that, I call them friends. If I see a boarding school that hasn't got very good food, then I'll ring George and say, we've got to fix this. And vice versa, he'll say, I think we've got a problem in this school. And we work really closely together. So they did a webinar on understanding food hygiene and handling food properly. Which is obviously quite critical because whilst any catering arrangements are for the main meals, lots of those kids are cooking bits and pieces in their boarding houses and doing things like that too. And so learning from the best is something that we think is really important. So we source that as a critical part of our expectations. We issue professional learning certificates to all of our staff and expect them to do somewhere between 10 and 20 hours of professional learning every year. That's what our expectation is, and we think that that's a critical part of what they could do to improve. And I was just thinking about your diversity before. One of the things we've got to remember is that not all boarding schools are the big, fancy, shiny ones in capital cities. 2 weeks ago, I was on Thursday Island at Torres Strait Casimeta, a beautiful boarding school which has 67 kids at the moment, with a view to building 12 more and another hostel of 30 which will go in, where they actually provide the opportunity for kids throughout the Torres Strait Island to go to Tagai State College. Now, those kids wouldn't have a place to go otherwise. There's 500 kids who should be going to high school in the Torres Strait, and there's only about 130 beds now. So that's an interesting space to do. And then, like last week, I was at Holy Spirit College in Cooktown, which is a boarding school that has only 32 kids who are living on the edge. They're kids who probably would be in jail if they went to boarding school, quite seriously. Indigenous kids, they're doing a fantastic job of looking after kids. So we must remember that there's a really diverse range of boarding schools across this country, which provide for all the different needs that we have. As I said, 75% of our kids are rural and remote, but that leaves 25% that aren't. Obviously, we struggled during the pandemic getting international kids, and that's been an area that will probably grow back over the next couple of years. And just to tie that all back together, one of the things that we've worked really closely with Fiona and George is making sure that the type of student in a boarding school, so where they come from, what sort of foods they generally would eat, are able to get those sort of foods in their boarding school kitchen so they feel a bit more at home.
And I think you raise a really good point, that the diversity is not just about the student cohort, it's about the schools themselves. I think that's a very important point to raise. Fiona Aveyard, if I could go back to you and the talk, there's a lot of talk these days about resilience and the importance of building grit into our children's experiences. And you talked about your son being in a wellness clinic wellbeing clinic at school and taking himself off there. My question to you, and by extension to the rest of the panel, is this idea of resilience and grit and teaching our children to get up when they fall down. Is that the role of the school, the role of the parent, a combination of all? And how are we doing that better? Are we doing it better? Are we teaching our kids through the boarding school experience to be resilient, or are we too hard? Or are we too soft?
Yeah, I do. I think, well, I mean, look, 70% of it comes from home, and then that 70% is supported at school and then probably enhanced if you've chosen the right school for your kids, in my opinion. They definitely work on, like they're children, and it's a journey. Like, your job's not done till they're 18 and left school, and so there's plenty of ups and downs. It's life. It's not. I think we had one start in year 7 this year. First term was just thrilling. It was like a long-term sleepover. Second term, he couldn't wait to get back early for rugby camp and all that sort of stuff. Really keen. Third term, about 2 days out from returning back, he's like, oh, I'm really going to miss home. Like, the day-to-day grind of it all sets in. And I think that's really normal, because at the end of the day, no matter how fancy or how fabulous it is, it's still school, and they can't wait to leave and get on with their lives. Like, it's really, but what they do well is kids. Like, they just seem to, there's not much the kids can throw up that surprise them. There's emerging issues in a modern world that we haven't come across before, but generally speaking, the kids aren't reinventing the wheel. Like, they're coming up with the same mischief year in and year out. So we've been, the schools and the parents, I think you have to work really closely together. And I'm a little bit old school. Like, we try to back the school if there's ever any issues, because I think that's where the benefits of learning and growing come from. But we always want to have kids to have a voice as well. And I think that's also in boarding. There's plenty of opportunities for even the more reserved kids to have a voice and to learn to speak up and to express, where they're at and what's happening.
Fiona Seabridge, you mentioned that idea of making sure that the children or the boarders have a voice, not necessarily with regard to food, but do you think that the boarding school experience these days gives kids enough of a voice or too much of a voice? It's a balancing act.
Yeah, I suppose from our perspective, I mean, we see the students in the context of how they are in the dining space and how they connect with the food service. And we're really encouraged when a school gives us access to the students to be able to talk to them and get feedback from them. I think that's really important. And at the same time, our responsibility is to allow them to give us that feedback for us to actually then act on it. Because what we find is it is in a situation where we get that feedback but nothing changes, it's really a negative experience for the students. And it's really important that they see that when they're contributing their feedback, that they actually see that it's being listened to.
And so, George, you would agree that it's about empowering the children, George?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I really do think there's that balance and that connection with food and the dining room space. That's why we encourage our exec chef, for example, to sit in the dining room so that the boarders feel comfortable if they don't like something or they want to see something different or more comfort food, there's that inclusion and that collaboration. It's not being frightened or scared not to ask the exec chef a question. So it's really trying to blend that together. And I think them having a voice is really important for us, and acknowledging and listening and then responding to that. And so things like masterclasses that we run are really important. Food's an exciting environment for boarders. They come there, they're really excited to see what's on for the day. So we don't try and create menus that are predictable as well. So they go every Friday, we're going to have this, and every Tuesday. So create interest and variety. And that's exciting. And that's why, for me, being in this space for 25 years and so passionate about it, is there's real duty of care. We provide 99% of their food intake. So it's quite an important role that we play in their experience over their X amount of years as a boarder.
You're making me smile because 40 years later I can still remember the days, and the swill that would be served up on said days. Richard.
It's so true. Yeah, Jenny, excuse me. I was laughing at Michael saying that because one good example is the boarders, if they're country boarders, they're used to eating a lot of red meat, and in a balanced diet, you have more fish. And I remember
Fish Fridays.
A while back now.
That's it.
I remember a while back, my kids, they're going, oh my God, we had fish and it was red. And, they're not used to different things, but it's that communication with the exec chefs and the staff that they're like, you really do. I know you're used to eating a lot of red meat, but this is really great for your diet because, and kids are, they're clever, they're smart, they're like, they get it. They're just like, they didn't need that communication to really understand and to talk them around foods they're unfamiliar with.
The red meat thing is really interesting. My daughter was at a boarding school and she's 12 years out now. But we, as a parent cohort, had to go to the school and say, you're not giving these kids enough red meat. They're all iron deficient. So that was something that we as a parent body had to try to change. But my son was a rower and a first 15 footballer, and they were actually given extra red meat, which, we were all paying the same fees, So if I was a chess player's mum, I would have been a bit browned off for that. But anyway.
Sorry, I'm going to butt in and say there's two great things that come to mind. First of all, I love the way that Fiona and George listen to the kids, but they also know what they need too. So when the kids say that they want just hot chips for lunch, they say, actually, no. And I'm really happy about that. Yeah, that's one. And the second thing is I still, to this day, don't eat casseroles very much because in my boarding life, that's what we had all the time, real sloppy food. And sloppy food doesn't work for me anymore.
I can't ever face into ham steak.
Wet dishes, all those wet dishes. Yeah, that's right.
And 40 years later, I'm still trying to get rid of the boarding school love handles. Richard, if I could stay with you for a minute on this question of resilience. In the bad old days, it was, as I said, it was just a blanket. We were all in one box. And, if there was a problem, you just sucked it up and you were expected to suck it up. And now there's more of an individualistic approach. Where's that balance between teaching kids to be resilient and to not fall down at the smallest challenge and being too tough? Where do you sit on that balance?
Yeah, it's an interesting one. I look at the situation myself really closely. I think boarding schools traditionally just teach kids to be independent young people. They can't help it. They have to learn to do things for themselves where they may have had that done for them at home. The greatest challenge I think we struggle with in this resilience section is when parents won't let go. Now, in the bad old days that we've been talking about, the parents didn't have much say. They could ring home for 3 minutes once a week. They could, go home maybe once a term, probably not just on holidays. Nowadays, there are many parents who are in touch with their daughters and sons, 2 or 3 times a day, which is insane and doesn't let the kids develop that resilience as well as they might. And that's one of the challenges that our boarding staff face, I reckon, is about teaching parents as much as teaching the boarders to let their kids grow up and stand on their own 2 feet and fall down a few times and then be there to pick them up. So to me, that's the greatest challenge that we do. One of the things that we've celebrated a couple of times at conferences is the concept of allowing introverts to be successful boarders, because it can be very easy in a large cohort of kids. If you've got 60 kids in your boarding house, it can be really easy for the loud ones to have all the say and for the loud ones to take over. And I think one of the things that our boarding staff are learning to do really well is to make sure that the quiet ones are listened to as well. So that's a really critical place. Fiona mentioned before the concept of having wellbeing centres. One of the things that we really feel is quite critical is that every boarding staff member should be trained in some sort of youth mental health. And that comes about because, we do first aid for physical needs, and that's a requirement, and it's part of the National Boarding Standard that was published in 2015. But there's not anything at this stage that requires our boarding staff to have some sort of youth mental health training. And that's one of those areas that we need to. And the pandemic has taught us that. There were lots of kids who were very, very keen to get back to boarding school when they could during the pandemic. Now I'm in Queensland. Our kids were lucky; they had 2 weeks at home maximum. We were able to get the boarding schools reopened really quickly. I really feel for those kids in Victoria. Those kids were sent home or locked in, which was just as damaging, I think. And there are some real work. There's some real work to do there. What we're finding, interestingly, is that those kids who were removed from that community living experience, those kids are struggling to learn how to live together. They've learned to be very selfish, I think. And it's one of the challenges that I think our boarding schools are facing this year more so than ever before, is helping kids learn those community living skills together.
Richard, I want to stay on this point. Sorry.
I was just going to agree with Richard, and I can probably speak from personal experience about the introvert, because my daughter had a leadership role in Year 12 at her boarding school, but when I dropped her off in Year 7, I spoke to her house mistress, and she often reminded me of the conversation as she got to know her. But I spoke to her and I said, "You'll think my daughter is shy, but she's not shy, but what she is reserved. And if you give her, she's a great listener, and if you give her a chance, you will be really amazed at her steely core and her strength and what she will bring." And in Year 12, when she was elected by her peers to a leadership role, the boarding mistress said to me, "It's just so great that it's not always the big noise in the room that gets these positions, that the girls, your daughter's a great listener, and the girls really respect that, and it's a skill and a quality that we celebrate." And so I think for me that what gave me great comfort as a parent was not the leadership role by any means, but it's the fact that in that boarding environment, they take the time to get to know your child intimately and know their inner workings and value their strengths, whatever they are. And I think there is genuinely a space for everybody in the boarding house if they're doing their job well. And it's, that's been our experience anyway.
Thanks, Fiona. And I know you've talked before about you also have an introvert son who is not as sporty, and he's he the one that's availing himself of the wellness?
Well, he's actually quite an extrovert. He's a people person, and but he's far from an elite athlete or an academic. And but what he has is an emotional intelligence and a great deal of empathy. He loves people. He's very engaged, and as he was only at school maybe 3 weeks, and the boarding staff were ringing me up, and they're like, "Oh my God, we love your son. He's just, his ability to read the room, his level of maturity, his empathy for other people. It's just," and so then immediately they kind of sort of moved him into positions where, if they were doing a leadership weekend or that type of stuff, because they're the qualities that they really want to emerge as leadership qualities within that school. And it's not just about being, the brainy one or the sporty one or anything like that. They really recognise those people skills and what those kids bring to the school. And our boarding experience has been overwhelmingly positive. The fact that your kids are recognised and heard is all that you really want.
And it's interesting. I had two brothers who went through probably I think among the darkest days of the boarding school environment in the mid 70s, and both of them emerged into adulthood with some significant mental health challenges. So when we talk about the good old bad old days, I think things are so much different now in terms of recognising that individuality. And I want to go back to that mental health component to all of you and how important physical health and nutrition are to that overall mental health state. Richard, perhaps I can start with you and then move to the other Fiona and George.
It's interesting you say that, because I reckon that the two critical things that make boarding work well is good food and good sleep. And those two things really, really affect every individual's mental health too. You know, I've just been reading a book about stolen focus, and I'm reading another one about burnout at the moment. And they all talk about the need to have good sleep and the need to have good food, you know, and that concept. So that's one of the reasons why we've worked really closely with Fiona and George to make sure that the food actually really suits the needs of our growing teenagers. You know, one of the problems, of course, is that when you're a boarding staff member, you don't need food for growing bodies. And that was one of my problems. You know, I certainly grew as I was a boarding staff member. But, you know, I think that the concept of getting that right and making the kids comfortable both in the dining room and then when it's time to go to bed is critical. You know, the big challenge we've got, of course, today is technology. And one of the great things that boarding schools do very well is take technology away from kids at night. Most of our dining rooms are now technology-free zones, so they have to talk to each other. They're really good moves, I think, for boarding schools to do to help in that space. And
George, perhaps you might jump in here with the importance of nutrition on overall well-being and mental health.
Yeah, look, I mean, there's an absolute strong connection to that. I think that if they're not having a balanced diet for the day, it does affect their sleep. So, for example, if you're not having a right dinner meal, for example, and you're having cereal or you're having Uber Eats pizzas with high carbs, high sugar at 10 o'clock at night, and you're not having low GI food during the day, that affects their sleep. And there's lots of studies around what that leads to: depression, it leads to a lot of other things, their focus in class and things like that. So food has a key part. That's why we focus a lot in terms of our dietitian going through the menu for the day and get that balance right. So it's all about it's not about quantity, it's about quality is the key, and having enough of that sort of variety. So if you look at the life of the day of a boarder, from breakfast to morning tea to lunch, afternoon tea, dinner, supper, you know, there's lots there. So you don't want to have it all brown, high carb food, high sugar food, toasties, cereals at the wrong time of the day. So it's ensuring that we have that and educate the boarders of the importance of that, and that then leads to really good sleep. They feel better. Like I think when you spoke earlier about sports and rowing, I mean, having a double breakfast and a double lunch is normal because they are losing a kilo when they come off the water. So it's important that we fuel their energy around that. So it's tailoring for those groups of students as well. So it has a absolute the focus of food and well-being is key.
That rowing season and football season was certainly the time I felt I got my fees worth.
It's an interesting piece of research that we've been looking into, that it's often cheaper to pay the boarding fees and put your 15-year-old son into boarding.
Particularly when your 15-year-old son brings the rowing team home for holidays. It's like throw a beast on the back lawn and stand clear. Fiona Seabridge, could you talk to me a little bit about, and I guess this marries into this, the difference between nutritional needs for boys and girls?
Yeah, so I mean, we talked about it earlier. I mean, we know that in terms of the girls, in terms of iron in particular, is a key element of their nutritional requirements. I mean, we have a lot of boarding houses where we've got all girls, we've got all boys, but we've also got co-ed. And for us, it's a lot about the girls' actual preferences for how they eat. So they want a lot more salads. They're a lot more interested in a plant-forward approach. And therefore, if we're seeing a lot of girls who want to eat more of a vegetarian, sometimes vegan diet.
Unheard of in our day, gosh.
And it's a totally changing space. And so it's really important that we're, the girls in particular, and this is, there's a big shift, that we're ensuring that there's enough plant-based protein in their menus to ensure that their energy needs are being met and sustained. The boys are very much around quantity. They're not as focused on quality. Again, the girls, it's more about making sure there's no visible fat on foods. They don't want to see any fat on sauces. And they want to see lean meats if they're having meats in their diet. They're less interested in the, the potatoes, the rices, I don't want to generalise, but there is a shift that we're seeing. So they do coexist in terms of in a co-ed environment, what they are eating, but they are needing, the girls particularly, more iron in their diet.
Thank you. We could talk, as Richard said, we could have 4 or 5 hours in this all day, but unfortunately we don't have that time. So I'm just going to throw one final question at you to tie it all back. And I'll ask each of you, perhaps starting with you, Fiona Aveyard, are boarding schools lifting their game?
Oh yeah, 100%. It's a completely different world than when I was at school, and I don't think they've overstepped the mark. But we were very much just a number when I went to boarding school, and it was crowd management rather than individual attention. And I get, you're certainly paying for it. Don't get me wrong, like that, but that's what we pay for, and it is a brave new world. Like, from everything from just the kids' well-being is the absolute focus and the centre of everything they do. And I'm, again, we could discuss that at length if that's a great thing. But as a parent who's trying to get their teenage kids through the secondary education, their HSC, and have them well prepped for life at uni or work or trade or whatever they go on to, it's this lovely transition that's sometimes got some sharp corners, don't get me wrong, but it is it's in a safe environment, and they're learning life skills that carry them for a long time.
Thank you. George, boarding schools lifting their game?
Oh, yes, there's no doubt, if I look back the last 25 years, they are certainly, from a catering perspective, it's a key pillar now. They're certainly investing in infrastructure. If you look at a lot of the boarding schools, they look like 3-star hotels. The layout, the flow, the food, the dining room. So they're really focusing on quality, and they're prepared to invest in it, and they know the importance that boarding is the heart and soul of the school. So I've certainly found over the last 10 years that is certainly something they're really keen to ensure that we always are improving and always looking at current trends and future trends. And the good thing about it from our perspective is the school involves us really early in the process. We don't come in and just do food and labour. We come in and look at the entire process from start to finish, engage really early, which really helps us as well.
Thank you. And Richard, probably as the head of the Boarding Schools Association, your idea on how boarding schools are lifting their game?
Well, I think one of the exciting things that I can say is that that's very much the case. I'd like to put Fiona on my payroll at the moment, because the words she said are very true. That whole concept about improving the service that we provide for each individual is quite critical. And we have really alert staff to know that. I come back to the fact that, it's all about training staff, and when staff know what their job is, then they can do a much better job of it. And instead of just dragging a few university students in off the street who wanted a free board and meals and worked a few hours to pay for that, we're now in a much, much healthier situation to be able to look after kids better. The most critical thing that we emphasise every day in every talk that we have is that it's actually all about the kids. And if we do a better job of looking after our boarders, then our boarding schools improve out of sight.
Thank you. I think that's a wonderful place to finish. And thank you so much for your insights, all of you, and for joining us today for the Boarding Schools Online Summit.